All right, introduction to international relations theory. There are various components of this. I have organized them into Roman numerals. I'm going to start with an introduction that does not have its own Roman numeral. The original question you probably have is, why should I care about international relations theory? That's a reasonable question. You're debating about it all the time, whether you know it or not, even on a domestic topic. Understanding the theoretical assumptions about the way the world system works, the way world politics works, the way the international where relations between countries work, all of that is very relevant to most of the issues that you debate. And you can better make those arguments and defend your arguments if you understand the theoretical foundations that your authors are accepting as parameters as when they're writing their arguments, when they're making their arguments. How is this relevant to debate? You're debating it all the time, and probably most importantly, in debates involving critiques or in very sophisticated debates involving disadvantages related to international relations, understanding international relations theory is really a prerequisite to having an intelligent conversation. Knowing the theories, at least the basics of the theories, will allow you to understand research better and allow you to understand the perspective that you find in your evidence better. But knowing it at a more advanced level and really understanding it is the thing that separates students who are just kind of overwhelmed by sophisticated IR arguments and those who are interested in them and can marshal evidence intelligently. It's also just very difficult to answer critiques of international relations if you don't understand international relations. And so even if you're not someone who wants to get into the wonky details on your own, sometimes the negative will make you do that because they will read an IRK. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to basically role play as Daniel Drezner. He's a professor of international politics at Tufts University, and he is a very prominent public intellectual. He writes in a variety of public-facing spaces, including the Washington Post. He wrote a book, which was the version I'm using is from 2015, called Theories of International Politics and Zombies. The rest of this lecture is drawn from that book. I'm going to direct quote from him extensively without saying quote unquote, because that just sounds weird. You should get the book. I think it's a very useful book for understanding. I think it's funny, and I think it's also just profoundly helpful. I will acknowledge before I begin that there are some shortcomings with Drezner's approach and with his book, and he acknowledges those as well. In debate, critical IR theory is in some ways more important than mainstream IR theory, and so tomorrow, in part 2 of this, and some of you I assume will be back for part 2, I'm going to introduce critical IR theory by critiquing Drezner's book and the arguments that I'm presenting today. So if you're listening to any of this and thinking, I disagree with it, that's reasonable, but just hold off on that until tomorrow when we will explore more of that. If you have questions, please save them until the end. Almost all of your questions about just basic IR theory stuff can be answered by Wikipedia or a site called Oxford Bibliographies, oxfordbibliographies.com, that has an excellent set of materials, or just do a deeper dive into some search results. And there's just tons of information written about international relations theory. My goal here with this lecture is to give you enough background so that you can start engaging that in a more thoughtful way. If you're interested in watching Drezner do a version of this talk, he did one. He's done several. There's many on YouTube, but the one that I like the best is from 2011. It's called Zombies, G20, and International Relations. Zombies, G20, and International Relations. He has slides. They're very funny, and you can get a sense of his humor. There are 7 now Roman numerals in this talk. The context, realism, liberalism, neoconservatism, constructivism, do domestic politics matter, and conclusions. And I will go very quickly in order to cover, and obviously I will repeat those labels as we go. So Roman numeral number 1, the context, zombies. Drezner says there are many natural sources of fear in world politics: terrorist attacks, lethal pandemics, natural disasters, climate change, financial panic, nuclear proliferation, ethnic conflict, global cyber warfare. Surveying the cultural zeitgeist, however, it is striking how an unnatural problem has become one of the fastest growing concerns in international relations. I speak of zombies, whether they're called ghouls, deadites, rotters, walkers, skells, stenches, deadheads, posthumans, the mobile deceased, or the differently animated. The specter of the living dead represents an important puzzle to scholars of IR and the theories we use to understand the world. What would be different, or what would different theories of international politics predict would happen if the dead began to rise from the grave and feast upon the living? How valid or how rotten are these predictions? So why did Drezner decide to write a book about zombies? Well, of course, he wanted to sell books, and it worked. He got a lot of attention from this. But he also makes a theoretical case about why this is a useful way to think about international relations theory. He says there are multiple existing paradigms that attempt to explain IR. Each has a different take on how zombies affect world politics and how political actors would respond to the living dead. I have decided to flesh out, and he'll continue to use these hilarious puns, how existing IR theories would predict what would happen in response to an outbreak of zombies. What might these theories predict will happen? What policy recommendations will follow from these theories? When will hiding and hoarding be the right idea? This analysis is useful as a way to stress test our existing theories of international politics. Scholars, commentators, and policy analysts rely on deductive theories as a cognitive guide in a complex world. One measure of their explanatory leverage is their ability to offer useful and counterintuitive predictions in the wake of exogenous shocks to the system. Surely an army of the ravenous living dead would qualify as such a shock. Zombies are the first perfect 21st century threat. They are not well understood by serious analysts. They possess protean capabilities, and the challenges they pose to states are very, very grave. Drezner acknowledges that international relations theories are sometimes imprecise, and we'll talk more about this tomorrow. But he says, some might argue that paradigmatic debates have yielded much more heat than light. The predictive power of these approaches has been underwhelming. Some go so far as to suggest that paradigms are unnecessary. Nevertheless, these paradigms do help to clarify what different IR theorists believe is important in world politics. Whether researchers or policymakers admit it or not, all coherent IR work proceeds from some paradigmatic assumptions. A theoretical attack of the undead can further reveal how these different approaches diverge in their predictions. In eliding from some internal theoretical disputes, I fully acknowledge that I am committing some conceptual violence to these paradigms. In fairness, the undead would likely do far worse. Hilarious. So before we proceed, Drezner requires us to understand and all be on the same page about zombies. I'm sure you've all had some interaction with zombie literature. He says, consistent with the Zombie Research Society, which is a real thing, I choose to treat the zombie as a biologically definable animated being occupying a human host with a desire to eat human flesh. From a national security perspective, the three relevant assumptions about zombie behavior are as follows. Number one, zombies desire human flesh. They will not eat other zombies because that is just gross. Number two, zombies cannot be killed unless their brain is destroyed. And to number three, any human being bitten by a zombie will inevitably become a zombie. Almost every modern zombie narrative adheres to these three rules. So they desire human flesh but will not eat other zombies. They cannot be killed unless their brain is destroyed, and if you get bitten and you're a human, you become a zombie. It's important to understand that because those are the assumptions that will shape the rest of this. There are different understandings of how a zombie attack could come about. Drezner says it doesn't matter. He says the starting point of our analysis is that the living dead are a transnational phenomenon. Either corpses reanimate across the globe or they spread outward from a single source. Either way, they are a threat that all countries must consider in crafting their foreign and national security policy. So that is the context. There is a new national security threat, international security threat. It is the rise of the undead. And there are zombies, and so what do international relations theories tell us is going to happen, and what do they suggest we do in response to this new threat from zombies? So Roman numeral number 2 is realism. Realism. You've probably heard of some of the major realist authors that you might encounter. John Mearsheimer, Stephen Walt, Kenneth Waltz, Robert Jervis, William Woolforth, Stephen Brooks, Aaron Friedberg, Charles Glazer. Lots of people that are very commonly cited in debate are realist authors. There's also several sources that you'll read evidence from that are often include realist scholarship. War on the Rocks is an explicitly realist publication. Many articles in the national interest are from realists. Many academic IR journals will publish articles from realists. So what in the world is a realist? Drezner says, all realists start with a common assumption that anarchy is the overarching constraint of world politics. Anarchy does not mean chaos or disorder, but instead the absence of a centralized, legitimate authority. There is no world government. With no monopoly on the use of force in world politics, every actor must adopt self-help measures to ensure continued existence. The primary actors are those that can guarantee their own survival, meaning states. In a world of anarchy, the only currency that matters is power. Power meaning the material capability to ward off pressure or coercion while being able to influence others. So warding off pressure or coercion and being able to influence others is how realists define power. If one state amasses more power, other states will have an incentive to balance against that state so as to prevent it from dominating everyone. The anarchic global structure makes it impossible for governments to fully trust each other, forcing all states to be guided solely by their own national interests. Realists, Drezner says, are very skeptical about the ability of international institutions to regulate world politics. States will consider the distribution of gains when thinking about cooperating with another actor. The question for realists is not, will both of us gain, but who will gain more? Cooperation will always be transient and unstable. Just as zombies will always crave human flesh, realpolitik states will always crave a more favorable distribution of capabilities. When relative gain concerns are paramount, cooperation is always ephemeral. Drezner continues, because anarchy is such a powerful constraint on state actions, realists are not particularly interested in the domestic politics of other countries. Whether a country has a democratic, autocratic, or revolutionary form of government has only a marginal effect on that country's foreign policy trajectory. The structure of anarchy is so powerful that it eventually forces all states into roughly similar policy preferences, maximizing security. That's the policy preference. This does not necessarily translate into power maximization. States that become too powerful risk triggering a security dilemma, acquiring so much power that other countries choose to form balancing coalitions against the rising power. Even realist scholars who believe in power maximization allow that the stopping power of water will likely deter any state from global overreach. Realists acknowledge that on occasion states deviate from these predictions because of domestic interests. When this happens, however, the competitive rigors of the system will force these actors to either change their behavior or they will wither away faster than a rotting corpse. So, in conclusion, realists focus like a laser beam on the international distribution of power. The waxing and waning of states corresponds to their influence over outcomes in world politics. Most realists posit that balance of power politics act as a natural regulating mechanism. Power transition theorists care about the relationship between the most powerful state, meaning the hegemon, and potential challengers to its primacy in world politics. If a hegemon is supplanted by a rising power, the likelihood of a great power war spikes, an argument you've certainly encountered in debate. When this situation has occurred in the past, from Sparta and Athens in ancient Greece to Great Britain and Germany prior to World War I, the world becomes fraught with uncertainty. In the past, the prospect of such a power transition has often triggered great power wars. If the rising power signals that it has revisionist aims, in other words, that it wants to rewrite the existing rules of world order, then such a conflict will be inexorable. So, what does realism think about zombies? Well, they won't change much. International relations would be largely unaffected, Drezner says. This paradigm would be unimpressed with the claim that a new existential threat to the human condition leads to any radical change in human behavior. Realists would share the perspective of Major West in 28 Days Later about the effect of a zombie apocalypse. Quote, "This is what I've seen in the 4 weeks since infection. People killing people, which is much what I saw in the 4 weeks before infection, and the 4 weeks before that, and before that, as far back as I care to remember, people killing people, which, to my mind, puts us in a state of normality right now," end quote. To realists, a plague of the undead would merely echo older plagues and disasters. Disease has already affected world politics, from the Black Death of the 14th century to the 1918-1919 influenza pandemic. Most of these plagues simply reified existing power relationships. Because more dynamic and powerful societies developed stronger immunities to plague, they gained a greater share of relative power during pandemics. Modern research shows us that wealthier and more powerful societies can weather natural disasters better than weaker, poorer states. Realists would see no reason to expect an epidemic of zombies to be any different in its effects. U.S. Strategic Command concurs, concluding that countries with more advanced, prepared, and robust healthcare and agricultural systems will be better able to mitigate many of the zombie phenomena effects. And U.S. Strategic Command does, in fact, have its anti-zombie plan. The realpolitik of zombies is that the strong will do what they can, and the weak must suffer devouring by reanimated, ravenous corpses. What about the balance of power? Would that be effective? Realists would acknowledge some shifts in the global distribution of power. Some governments will be better placed to repulse the zombies than others. Those with greater security and communications infrastructure should be able to put down any internal zombie insurrections and reestablish domestic order or block cross-border zombie incursions. States with low population densities would have more time to adapt. Geographic isolation would be no guarantee of zombie prevention. The stopping power of water for the undead is limited because they have no need to breathe. Nevertheless, geography will matter. Defense is easier than offense on certain kinds of terrain, such as coastlines or mountain ranges. Realists would expect countries with mountainous borders to be more likely to thwart hordes of foreign flesh-eating ghouls. Some states would undoubtedly be completely overrun by the living dead. So is there going to be cooperation to address this problem? No. The best tactics and strategies for defeating zombies would spread quickly throughout the international system, regardless of the ethical or moral implications of such plans. Realists predict balance of power politics. Wouldn't the specter of the undead create a balancing coalition against all ghouls? This possibility cannot be ruled out. If ghouls overran a significant cluster of states and created a sufficient number of fresh ghouls, a power transition dynamic could present itself. Post-human actors could be seen as the rapidly rising power. A containment strategy would no doubt be proposed as a means of limiting the territorial expansion of the undead. Most realists would be very skeptical, however, about the robustness of a universal anti-zombie alliance. First, buck passing would be an equally likely outcome. In a buck passing situation, states would refrain from taking an active stance against the zombie hordes in the hopes that other countries would do the dirty work of balancing in their stead. So even if a powerful state tried to amass an anti-zombie coalition, other governments might commit to such an alliance in name only. At the same time, small supporter states would fear that powerful countries would use a global quest against zombies as a subterfuge to augment their own capabilities and interests. Past history offers support. The Soviet Union installed puppet governments in its military theater of operations at the end of World War II to develop a buffer zone between itself and the Western Alliance. Even during the peak of the Cold War, NATO members repeatedly clashed over the scope and nature of the strategic embargo placed on the Communist bloc because some members of the Western Alliance benefited disproportionately from trade with the Soviet Union. A similar dynamic played itself out during the American-led global war on terror. The U.S. tried to coordinate global efforts against all non-state actors that employed this tactic. Other countries responded by adding groups that were considered national threats but did not quite fit the definition of terrorist. Realists would predict a similar dynamic at work in any kind of anti-zombie crusade, except on an even grander scale. In the past, natural disasters have exacerbated pre-existing conflicts among humans. States could exploit the threat from the living dead to acquire new territory, squelch movements, settle old scores, or subdue rivals. China could use the zombie threat to justify an occupation of Taiwan. Russia could use the same excuse to justify intervention in its near abroad. In World War Z, the conflict allows Moscow to reabsorb Belarus. India and Pakistan would likely accuse each other of failing to control the zombie problem in Kashmir. The US would not be immune from the temptation to exploit the zombie threat as a strategic opportunity. How large would the army of the Cuban undead need to be to justify the deployment of the 82nd Airborne Division? In the end, realists would evoke the cautionary words of former President John Quincy Adams and warn against going abroad in search of monsters to destroy. What about interactions between humans and zombies? Some realists would go further, arguing that human-zombie alliances of convenience could be just as likely to emerge as human-human alliances. For zombies to survive and thrive, they must avoid losing their brains, and like humans, they also must adapt to the rigors of anarchy and world politics. While some emerging zombie governments might pursue radical anti-human policies at first, the anarchical system would eventually discipline a moderation of views. In a world of sophisticated zombies, alliances between human states and zombie states are possible. Any government that tried to develop a grand coalition targeting the undead would immediately trigger the security dilemma. Realpolitik states could exploit any move toward an idealistic global war on zombies by creating temporary alliances of convenience with emerging ghoul governments. A more passive strategy would be to encourage what Mearsheimer labels bait and bleed and bloodletting strategies. In these instances, realist states would try to foment conflict between anti-zombie states and the ghouls themselves, profiting at the relative losses incurred by both sides. I bet you're thinking of examples related to our arguments. Save the question till the end. Realism says zombie governments would actually be pretty much the same as human governments. They would advocate non-interference in how zombie states treated their own living and undead populations. Realists would conclude that there would be little intrinsic difference between human states and zombie states. Human beings have an innate lust for power in the realist paradigm. Zombies have an innate lust for human flesh. Both are scarce resources. Regardless of individual traits, domestic institutions, or variations in the desire for living flesh, human and zombie actors alike are subject to the same powerful constraints of anarchy. Both sets of actors would engage in strategic opportunism to advance their interests in anarchy. The fundamental character of world politics would therefore remain unchanged. Realists would caution human governments against expending significant amounts of blood and treasure to engage in far-flung anti-zombie adventures, particularly blood. So, what can we learn from this about realism in debate? Well, many arguments in debate are premised on realist assumptions, but there are many differences in the conclusions that they draw. In debate, I think we identify the name of a theory, and then we think that that answers the question. It doesn't answer the question at all. It just gives us a way of thinking about the question. So realists approach the question in terms of power and in terms of an understanding of the international system as anarchic, but they disagree about the implications of those theoretical assumptions. The kind of most recent thing that students get very interested in is this distinction between offensive and defensive realism. There are differences between those two, so I'll break them down now. The divide is between authors who are primarily defensive realists, that's mostly associated with Kenneth Waltz and his followers, and offensive realists like John Mearsheimer and his followers. There's a pretty good explainer from Malfarsi about the differences. So the core difference is that defensive realists assert that states develop and maintain policies and programs aimed at promoting security through a defensive approach. So given the anarchic system and given the power relationship that is at the heart of international relations, states then try to defend themselves. Offensive realists assess that the programs and policies developed and maintained by states are aimed not only at promoting security, but also at increasing their power to dominate the system. So they slightly disagree on how to handle anarchy. Defensive realism contends that states navigate through anarchy by balancing their power through arms race or capability building. An imbalance resulting from a state pursuing dominance is counterbalanced by other states seeking to maintain the status quo, so the international system punishes aggressors, according to the defensive realists. The offensive realists argue that states inherently desire dominance because they are power-maximizing actors. So offensive realists believe that the international system rewards states that are able to secure and maintain their dominance. They also have slightly different opinions about what the military is supposed to be doing. The primary purpose of the military under defensive realism is to maintain security by having the capacity to defend against aggression. Defensive capability is superior to offensive capabilities in this view, and the collective military capabilities of different states creates a stabilizing effect, so the kind of cumulative military capabilities of all states. Offensive realists argue that the primary purpose of the military is to display the power of a state through aggression, thus further depressing threats from other states. They kind of have similar opinions about state survival, but again, they slightly disagree. They agree that states are driven by self-interest and self-preservation through power and security, but defensive realists and offensive realists have different opinions about that. Defensive realists believe that states are only interested in maintaining their security through defensive measures. Offensive realists think that states are interested in conquest and that the best way to survive, so kind of the best defense is a good offense, is to demonstrate their power and prevent other states from attaining similar levels of power. They also have slightly different views about mistrust, although they agree with the fundamental premise. Both of those theories claim that because states can never be absolute about the true and specific intentions of other states, mistrust is inevitable and pervasive. But offensive realists argue that mistrust is not only prevalent but also constant. Defensive realists contend that mistrust is variable and amenable to change through international cooperation, primarily through mutual security agreements. So an offensive realist thinks there's so little possibility of mistrust that we can just never do anything to make our relationship more trusting. A defensive realist is willing to admit that in some spots there can be relatively more or relatively less trust. The biggest misconceptions that students have about realism in debate is that it is pro-war. It rarely is. Offensive realists oftentimes do want to expand military power, but realists often are the most anti-war of the various groups, especially modern wars, humanitarian wars. Realists are not interested in fighting humanitarian wars. The other kind of misunderstanding is that realism is pro-hegemony. It is in a sense. It's in the sense of power maximization in a unipolar sense. So the United States should be the predominant power in the international system. But most defenses of American hegemony are actually liberal or neoconservative. And so most of the impact cards that you read in debate that are hegemony impacts are actually not at all realist. And so the misconception is that realism is a prescription for foreign policy dominance in democracy promotion and dominating the liberal international order. Those are actually liberal arguments and neoconservative arguments, and we'll get to those in a minute. But understanding the fundamental claim of the realist that the international system is anarchic and that therefore states have to maximize their power and security within that system, it leads to a whole range of conclusions that you'll often find in your debate arguments. But you need to understand that's where the realists are coming from. That's how they arrive at their conclusions. That doesn't mean that they all agree. There are robust debates about every question about foreign policy among realists, not just because some are offensive and some are defensive. It's just that none of these questions can be fully answered. It's always speculation, and then they speculate in different ways, but they speculate based on the same assumptions. They agree the system is anarchic. They agree that power maximization is the thing that states do. They agree that states are worried about other states gaining at their expense, and then they draw different conclusions about how to explain behavior, in particular behavior, or giving prescriptions. All right, Roman numeral number 3 is liberalism. Liberalism. The major liberalist authors you might have heard of in debate: John Eikenberry, Joseph Nye, Robert Keohane, Thomas Rees. There are others. Drezner says, there are many varieties of liberalism. All liberals share a common belief. Cooperation is still possible in a world of anarchy. Liberals look at world politics as a non-zero-sum game. Non-zero-sum game, that's the essential difference. Mutual cooperation on issues ranging from international trade to nuclear nonproliferation to disease prevention can yield global public goods on a massive scale. These gains are not always distributed evenly, remember that's a concern of the realists, but they do make all actors better off than they would be in the absence of policy coordination, another fundamental disagreement with the realists. Major actors in world politics therefore have an incentive to realize the benefits that come from long-term mutual cooperation and avoid the costs that come with mutual defection. Liberals do not believe that cooperation outcomes always happen. I think that's a misunderstanding. In some cases, preferences might be so divergent that no bargain can be struck among the actors. Even if a non-zero-sum bargain is possible, the incentive to realize these gains does not guarantee that collaboration takes place. The benefits generated by cooperation are often non-excludable. In other words, anyone will benefit from broad-based cooperation even if they themselves do not cooperate. For example, if a plucky band of survivors were to devise a way to eliminate the plague of the undead, all humans would benefit regardless of whether they helped or not. This creates a free rider problem. Free rider problem, another important tenet of liberalism. The conundrum for liberals is that while an outcome of mutual cooperation is better than one of mutual defection, all are best off in a situation in which they can unilaterally defect. Since every actor has these same incentives, the outcome can be a tragedy of the commons, that's the outcome of the free rider problem, where everyone defects even though everyone would have been better off cooperating. So, how does liberalism square that circle? Well, the liberal paradigm offers multiple strategies to overcome the tragedy of the commons. Conditions that lengthen the shadow of the future increase the likelihood of cooperation. The longer one's time horizon, the greater the rewards from mutual cooperation are in comparison to the fleeting benefits from free riding. If an actor expects to be around for a while, then response strategies that punish non-cooperation but play well with nice actors, such as tit for tat, can sustain multilateral cooperation over the long term. So how do you get that? Economic interdependence. That reduces the incentive to defect from the cooperation by magnifying the gap in gains between a world of collective action and a world of mutual distrust. Governments will be less likely to cheat in the short term if they know it means they will lose the benefits from trade in the long term. Multilateral institutions that monitor and disseminate information can ensure that cheating will be detected and punished. Institutions can reassure all participating players that they are on the same page in terms of the rules of the game, and they clarify how and when those rules will be broken. Another way, democracy. Democracies are more likely to cooperate with each other. Liberals posit that democracies are more likely to have similar preferences, making cooperation easier. More significantly, domestic laws and institutions provide democracies with the means to credibly commit to international agreements. Liberals allow that the Hobbesian war of all against all, predicted by realism, could happen, but only under very extreme conditions. A world of economic interdependence, democratic governments, and international institutions should foster extensive amounts of multilateral cooperation. That is the fundamental difference of opinion between realists and liberals. So, what happens with the zombies? Well, at first glance, the liberal paradigm appears to be a bad fit for a zombie genre that specializes in apocalypses. The tragedy of liberalism in a universe with zombies is that some of its central tenets would accelerate the spread of flesh-eating ghouls. Liberals advocate an open global economy in order to foster complex interdependence and lock in incentives for governments to cooperate. Just as open borders foster greater migration of people in pandemics, they would also facilitate the cross-border spread of both the undead and infected human carriers. Liberal policy prescriptions would appear to exacerbate the first stages of the zombie menace. It is little wonder that so many critical theorists equate the unchecked spread of zombies with the unchecked spread of capitalism itself. Okay, but how does liberalism going to explain how do we cooperate? How do we solve this? Well, liberals acknowledge that sustainable cooperation with zombies would be next to impossible. One would be hard-pressed to devise sanctions that would compel zombies into cooperating. The divergence of preferences is also too great. The refrain in Jonathan Colton's song "Re Your Brains," written from a zombie's point of view, best encapsulates the implacable nature of the zombie bargaining position. All we want to do is eat your brains. We're not unreasonable. I mean, no one's going to eat your eyes. All we want to do is eat your brains. We're in an impasse here. Maybe we should compromise. If you open up the doors, we'll all come inside and eat your brains. If this represents the zombie bargaining position, then the liberal assumption of a non-zero-sum bargain does not hold. In the tragedy of the zombies game, the dominant strategy for zombies is to eat humans. Tit-for-tat strategies would not work. Neither cooperation nor coordination is possible with the living dead. Liberalism does, however, predict that the zombies will start cooperating with each other. The most important liberal insight is a possible answer to one of the biggest mysteries in zombie studies, the failure of ghouls to ever attack each other. So why is it in zombie movies that they never go after each other? We assume that zombies have no wish to eat each other, but it is surprising that they do not turn on each other when trying to divvy up a human carcass, especially as human flesh grows scarce. However, zombies have either tolerated each other's company or actively cooperated to defeat humans. Why? The liberal paradigm provides a simple, rational answer. The living dead have the longest possible shadow of the future. John Maynard Keynes famously commented that in the long run, we are all dead. In the long run, the undead still have to interact with each other, and therefore they have the strongest of incentives to cooperate. If zombies hang together, then humans face the danger of hanging separately. But humans aren't just going to give up. They're going to try something. So what are they going to do? Well, they would predict that the incentive for multilateral cooperation among humans would be very, very powerful. The proliferation of the differently animated represents a classic negative externality problem of economic globalization. Countries that profit from trading with each other would nevertheless reward a third party, flesh-eating ghouls, by unwittingly facilitating their spread. States would therefore view zombies the same way they viewed other public bads that emerged from the open global economy, such as money laundering or foodborne diseases. Powerful governments would create and reinforce international institutions designed to control their spread. The CDC publicly pledged to provide technical assistance to international partners should the dead start to rise from the grave. The zombie menace would touch so many different spheres of life that liberals would predict a regime complex to emerge. A welter of international governmental organizations, including the United Nations Security Council, the World Health Organization, and the International Organization for Migration, would promulgate a series of policies and protocols designed to combat existing zombie hordes and prevent further outbreaks. A coordinating body, perhaps even a World Zombie Organization, or WZO, would need to be formed in order to handle all of the overlapping health, trade, and security issues. In the end, some organization would announce a comprehensive and integrated de-zombification strategy with sufficient buy-in from stakeholders across global civil society as their plan of action. The liberal expectation would be that a counter-zombie regime complex could make significant inroads into the zombie problem. The public benefits of wiping the undead from the face of the earth are quite significant, boosting the likelihood of significant policy coordination. The undead would fall into the same category of systemic threats such as terrorism and global pandemics, where states have engaged in meaningful cross-border cooperation in the past. The question of regime effectiveness that has haunted international relations scholarship for decades would rise again. So liberal security regimes such as NATO or the Chemical Weapons Convention have a credible track record of success, according to liberals, and the ability of both security and health regimes to monitor and spread information quickly in the era of instant messaging would facilitate rapid reactions to the zombie problem at an early stage. Globalization has certainly fostered the technical and regulatory coordination necessary for enhancing biosecurity. At a minimum, one would expect a significant rollback and stringent regulation of the living dead. However, liberalism predicts that this is not going to effectively stop the problem in its entirety. So even if problems with current international law are fixed, zombies represent a tough test for global governance structures. They are the most difficult kind of governance problem, a prohibition regime. Prohibition regime, something that liberals are not particularly effective at solving. Unless every single ghoul is hunted down and destroyed beyond recognition, a recurrent spread of the undead remains a possibility. The international regimes designed to eliminate disease demonstrate the difficulties inherent in this task. The scourge of smallpox has been erased, but few other diseases have been completely and totally eradicated. The persistence of AIDS, polio, malaria, tuberculosis, and the myriad strains of influenza demonstrate the challenges that would face an international counter-zombie regime. The other problem is that non-democracies would make it very difficult to combat the zombie problem. The liberal paradigm would predict two significant loopholes that could form within the confines of a global counter-zombie regime. Some countries might fail to provide timely information about zombie outbreaks until the problem had escalated beyond local control. Authoritarian countries are often reluctant to admit health crises because of the threat such an admission could have on state control over society. Non-democratic regimes are less likely to invest in the public goods necessary to prevent or contain disasters. This is one reason why the loss of life from disasters is greater in authoritarian countries. Local officials could delay reporting a zombie outbreak up the chain of command for fear of being the bearer of bad news. Developing countries might lack the infrastructure to detect the reemergence of the living dead. This would certainly, they would fear the economic impact of any policy response by large market jurisdictions to an announced outbreak of zombies. China's initial refusal to notify the rest of the world of its cases of SARS back in 2002-2003 is an exemplary case of this kind of policy conundrum. At the same time, liberals predict that non-governmental organizations would mobilize to try to solve this problem. It would not be surprising if NGOs devoted to the defense of the living dead acted as an impediment to their eradication. So in the same way that there are entities trying to stop the United States from killing terrorists, there would be NGOs that would stop the world from killing the zombies. Global civil society can raise the transaction costs of implementing the rules of global governance. Drezner says at least one nonprofit organization in favor of zombie equality already exists, Great Britain's Citizens for Undead Rights and Equality. The formation of more powerful activist groups, Zombie Rights Watch, Zombies Without Borders, Zombaid, People for the Ethical Treatment of Zombies, or Occupy Human Streets would undoubtedly make it difficult for a WZO to achieve perfect eradication. The likelihood of a zombie leaks entity publishing sensitive and classified information about the counter-zombie regime also seems quite strong. So, what's the bottom line? What can liberals offer us in the face of a zombie threat? Well, they can provide a partial solution. While pitfalls could prove problematic, Drezner says they should not be overstated. China has moved down the learning curve as a result of the SARS episode discussed before. In 2009, they were much more transparent during the swine flu epidemic. As countries have adapted to the problem of pandemics, fewer of them would be expected to conceal a growing problem of the undead. Even if multilateral solutions prove to be inadequate, liberals would envision the emergence of mini-lateral or regional organizations to act as a backstop. The U.S. would likely respond to any failure of a WZO by creating a North American counter-zombie agreement to handle the problem regionally. One would expect the European Commission to issue the mother of all directives to cope with the issue. The Association of Southeast Asian Nations, Mercosur, the Arab League, and the African Union would not be far behind. The bulk of global civil society would also unlikely raise too much of an objection to the eradication of the undead. Zombie rights would likely be one of those issues that more powerful NGOs would resist pushing on their advocacy agenda for fear of triggering donor fatigue or political backlash. So the liberal paradigm would predict an outcome that would be imperfect and vulnerable to criticism over time, much like the European Union in its current form. But the system would also be expected to function well enough to ward off the specter of a total zombie apocalypse. Zombie flare-ups would no doubt take place. Quasi-permanent humanitarian counter-zombie missions under UN auspices would likely be necessary in failed states. Liberals would acknowledge that permanent eradication is unlikely. But the reduction of the zombie problem to one of many manageable threats would be a foreseeable outcome. So to use the lexicon of liberals, most governments would kill most zombies most of the time. So liberalism in debate. Liberalism is often something that we debate about. A lot of our advantages are about liberalism. And the reason they're about liberalism is because the liberals have desirable goals about the international system. So if you've ever read an impact card about the liberal international order, you're reading a card about liberalism. You're not reading a card about realism or neoconservatism. It's one of debate's most popular impacts. And I have an entire separate lecture about the liberal international order if you would like to watch it on YouTube. I'm not going to repeat all that there. But many arguments are rooted in liberalism, and again, liberals disagree extremely vehemently among one another. They have certain assumptions about the nature of the international system. They have assumptions that differ from the realists, but that doesn't tell them what the answer is. That just gives them a framework for thinking about the problem. And so liberals are a wide spectrum of positions, and different liberals will have different takes on explanations for current situations and proposed solutions for those. But the thing that they're constantly thinking about is how can we build rules, how can we build institutions, how can we build norms that will shape the international system in a way that is to the benefit of all, even though at any moment every country has an incentive not to participate in that. And so the big problem for a liberal is how can you say that there is an international law, that there is an international international human rights law, that there are human rights, that there's international rules, that these institutions have any enforcement power when there is no army, when there is no entity that can enforce them. And so the classic realist critique of the liberalist, or of the liberal, is that yes, these ideas all sound great in theory, but they are just completely made up and they're figments of your imagination, because ultimately states just have to act to maximize their power. And you cannot constrain them with institutions. Institutions might serve certain states' power, but they don't truly constrain state behavior. Liberalists disagree. They think that even though the international system is anarchic when it starts, we can make it less anarchic through the design of institutions and liberal norms that then shape nations' behavior. So in debate, a lot of your impact cards are liberal. A lot of your hedge good arguments are liberal. Eikenberry is liberal. Sometimes realists and liberals will come to the same conclusion. So you can find evidence from Eikenberry, Woolforth, and Brooks that realist authors, taking realist assumptions, and liberal authors, taking liberal assumptions, agree about a policy prescription. And that's good, and that's something that you'll find a lot, and I'll talk about that again in the conclusion. Accepting a certain paradigm or a certain theory to explain the world does not give you the answer. And so in what I assume many students find unexpectedly, a lot of times there are consensus across party lines or theory lines about what the policy should be. But liberalism is the thing that you're debating about most often. It is the thing that when you have an international impact, an LIO impact, an impact about soft power, all of that is liberalism, and that's why realism often writes the best cards to answer liberalism, because they'll say, that's pie in the sky, that's utopian, how do you get over the tragedy of the commons problem, how do you get over the free riding problem? You can't. That's why your system and your ideas don't work. All right, Roman numeral number 4, neoconservatism. Neoconservatism. Major neoconservative authors, Robert Kagan, Joshua Moravchik, Gary Schmidt, used to be Francis Fukuyama, although he's kind of left the party. Pretty much everyone has. The important thing to note is that no one really self-identifies as neoconservative anymore. A few people do, but most don't because of the fall of the Bush administration. But it's important to understand neoconservatism because it often undergirds the most popular debate impacts. So Drezner says neoconservatives are treated as analytically distinct from either realists or liberals. Most IR scholars view neoconservative foreign policies as possessing a mix of liberal and realist tenets, but some believe that this approach represents an altogether different paradigm. On the one hand, neocons agree with liberals about the importance of the democratic peace. Like liberals, neoconservatives believe that a world of democracies would be a more secure global order. They accept the notion that democracies will not fight each other, and therefore the world is a safer place when there are more democracies. Neocons also agree with liberal internationalists that American hegemony contributes to a more just world order. On the other hand, neoconservatives share the realist skepticism about international institutions. Neocons disdain multilateral institutions as a weapon of the weak and the devious. According to the neoconservative worldview, international institutions and international law only constrain democracies because of their adherence to the rule of law. Despotic states benefit from cynically embracing multilateralism in theory but not in practice. Neoconservatives do not trust the foreign policy intentions of authoritarian countries. They're also wary of the ability of democratic states to maintain their vigilance in such a dangerous world. Like realists, neocons fret about the enervating effects of democracy on the practice of foreign policy. So how are they going to react to the zombie wars? Well, they're going to try to destroy them. So American neoconservatives are very quick to spot threats and conflicts. In recent years, they have articulated many such threats to the American way of life, including those emanating from Russia, China, Iran, North Korea, Al-Qaeda, Islam, the European Union, and the United Nations. Provided that the morass of other potential existential threats do not distract them, one would expect neoconservatives to detect the zombie menace at an early stage. The neoconservative policy response to an uprising of the undead flesh eaters would be simple and direct. Zombies are an existential threat more serious than any clash of civilizations. To paraphrase Robert Kagan, humans are from Earth and zombies are from hell. Neither accommodation nor recognition would be sustainable options. The zombies hate us for our freedom, specifically our freedom to abstain from eating human brains. So, what do? Well, neoconservatives would scoff at the realist contention that zombies are like every other actor in world politics, and at the liberal contention that global governance structures could cope with the zombie menace. This school of thought would instead recommend an aggressive and militarized response to ensure the continued hegemony of the human race. Rather than wait for the ghouls to come to get us, neoconservatives would recommend proactive policy options that would take the fight to the undead. Their policy preference would be for an armed invasion of the central region in the zombie-affected area. Deploying armed forces in ghoul-infested territory would serve two purposes. First, it would act as the zombie equivalent of flypaper, diverting zombies from expanding their dominion. Second, this use of force would eventually drain the swamp of the undead menace. The neoconservative policy preference on zombies is predicated on the revolution in military affairs permitting swift victory. Based on this military doctrine, neoconservatives would recommend relying on high-tech combat tactics with a heavy focus on air power and special forces to shock and awe the living dead into submission. The hardcore neoconservative position would assert that the use of American power would create a new reality in which the zombies themselves would yearn to break free of their undead state and rejoin the human-based community. Moderate neoconservatives would posit that after creating a human outpost in the center of zombie-infested territory, humans in neighboring zombie-afflicted nations would be inspired to rise up and liberate themselves from their undead oppressors. All neoconservatives would welcome a crusade against the undead as worthy of the martial spirit and national greatness that embody the best virtues America has to offer. They would also connect the zombie issue to other issues. A war against the living dead would be a war against evil itself. In their counter-zombie plan, U.S. Strategic Command explicitly notes the need for decisive, overwhelming, and possibly unilateral military force to defeat the undead. However, other elements of neoconservatism might undercut the long-term viability of their initial plans. For example, neoconservatives frequently assume that all adversaries are part of a single axis or alliance of evil enemies. That assumption works when confined to zombies, but it is unlikely that neoconservatives would stop there. Because of neoconservative hostility to authoritarianism, they would be inclined to see zombies and despots as part of the same overarching threat. They would inevitably identify reanimated corpses as part of a bigger World War IV against a so-called axis of evil dead that could include Venezuela, Iran, Syria, Hezbollah, Hamas, Al-Qaeda, China, and Russia, as well as the combined armies of the undead. Expanding the list of enemies would sabotage any attempt at broad-based coalition warfare, hindering military effectiveness in a global war on zombies. So, what are they going to do when it doesn't work right away? Well, the military doctrine of shock and awe, combined with the light footprint of forces on the ground, would prove disastrous in a military campaign against the undead. The doctrine would likely have zero effect on zombies. What if the enemy can't be shocked and awed? Not just won't, but biologically can't. Such a strategy would only trigger a fresh wave of flesh-eating ghouls to rise up. If history is any guide, the initial occupying force would be drawn down too quickly. Over the long term, military forces would likely be enmeshed in a protracted, bloody insurgency from the undead. Indigenous human populations would quickly lose faith in the U.S. military's ability to quell the zombie hordes. With a massive surge in troops and material to clear and hold pockets of zombie-free territory, the neoconservative approach to flesh-eating ghouls might yield modest successes in the long run. The cost would be appalling. The failure of a surge strategy would lead to an inevitable and catastrophic policy response, as demonstrated in 28 weeks later. When a zombie outbreak occurs in the latter half of the film, military forces are quickly given orders to shoot on sight regardless of whether the person is or isn't infected. They're executing Code Red. Step 1, kill the infected. Step 2, containment. If containment fails, then Step 3, extermination. By the end of that film, despite extreme measures that include the firebombing of London, the zombie infection escapes quarantine and spreads to continental Eurasia. So neoconservatism. Neoconservatism is often an impact that you read in debate. You wouldn't say it that it's neoconservative, but it is the impact that you're reading in debate. You're reading an impact about U.S. military dominance. You're reading an impact about forcible democracy promotion, sustainable U.S. presence in other regions. You're reading evidence about the military defeat of terrorism. All of this stems from this neoconservative merger, kind of creative merger of liberal ideas and realist ideas. So in some ways, neoconservative arguments agree with realists. They agree that international institutions just constrain democracies and aren't effective. But they also agree with liberals that democracy is really valuable and that democracy can make the world a better and safer place. But then they throw in this whole military thing where the way to achieve that is to forcibly create democracy in other countries. So what Drezner is doing here in explaining what would happen to zombies is really just a rundown of what happened in Iraq and to a lesser extent in Afghanistan. So the neoconservative position is often weirdly tacked on to liberalist advantages or even realist advantages. And the reason I think that you can probably speculate is that the neoconservative impact cards are by far the best impact cards in debate because they'll use the most extreme language, they'll use the most existential threat language. Neoconservatives think everything is an existential threat. They use that term. They don't mean it in the same way we mean it in debate, but it doesn't matter because it's close enough. They will use very aggressive, conclusionary words. They'll often use inflammatory rhetoric, and so that becomes attractive as an impact card. Liberals tend to write bad impact cards. Realists tend to write bad impact cards, with the exception of like U.S.-Russia war or whatever. And so the neoconservatism it's rare that a team will just advocate neoconservatism in a debate, but they'll often be drawing from neoconservative ideas at the impact level. And so when you're breaking down an international relations argument, figuring out where is this impact coming from? Is this a neoconservative impact? Can be very helpful. And then especially if you're going to debate a critique argument, I wouldn't defend that. It's very susceptible to defense or to indictment. It is helpful to understand this perspective because I think understanding neoconservatives, and the reason that Drezner includes this in the book, is that it helps to understand how realism and liberalism can kind of be put together in different ways. And I think it helps to demonstrate the broader point from before, that even though these authors, these theorists, come to the problem with different assumptions about how the world works, they often arrive at the same conclusions. So you can find a hedge good impact card from a realist, from a defensive realist, an offensive realist, from a liberalist, and from a neoconservative. And they all had different assumptions about how the world works, but they've all come to the same conclusion, or at least general conclusion about policy direction, and they've come to an agreement. Now, you can also find people within each of those schools of thought that would seriously and aggressively disagree with any of those proposals. But neoconservatism is an interesting one because it highlights how these theories are not monolithic and how they can be combined in different ways. Roman numeral 5, constructivism. Constructivism. There are some major constructivist authors that you might have heard about in debate. Alexander Wendt is the most popular. Richard Ashley, you might have heard. Ole Waver, I think is how you say that. It's the one with the A and the E put together into one letter. Frederick Cratchewell, you might have heard of. So constructivism is the newest international relations paradigm to kind of achieve canon status. And Drezner says, just as with the realist and liberal paradigms, there exists a plethora of constructivist approaches. Constructivist approaches do share a set of core assumptions, however. These assumptions and causal mechanisms revolve around two central tenets: the social construction of reality and the importance of identity in explaining and interpreting behavior on the world stage. So the social construction of reality and the importance of identity in explaining international behavior. For constructivists, material factors such as economic wealth and military power are important, but even more important are how social structures filter and interpret the meaning of those material capabilities. For example, zombies are hardly the only actors in the social world to crave human flesh. Cannibals, sharks, and really hungry bears will also target Homo sapiens if there is sufficient opportunity and willingness. Nevertheless, zombies are perceived to be a much greater threat to humankind. Why? Well, there are material factors to consider. To our knowledge, bears can't turn human beings into more bears by biting them. But constructivists would also argue that this is an incomplete explanation. Zombies threaten the powerful human norm of not devouring each other for sustenance or pleasure, and therefore arouse greater security concerns as a result. Constructivists argue that transnational norms are a powerful constraint on action in world politics. Nuclear weapons, for example, are the most powerful destructive force in human history, but they have never been used in combat since 1945. Social constructivists argue that over time, a taboo is a very important word, has developed regarding their use. Within societies, actors will usually refrain from violating powerful social norms, taboos, because they do not want to be ostracized from their peers. Constructivist scholars argue that this effect also exists in global society. By and large, governments want to avoid being ostracized by other actors in the international community. Just as important is the role that identity plays in defining actors and their preferences. Identities are developed or constituted through mutual recognition. Authoritative actors are considered legitimate in the international community not only because of self-recognition, but because others recognize them as legitimate. Actors, including but not limited to states, define themselves in part by distinguishing themselves from the other. This provides all actors a greater sense of ontological security that guides their actions and beliefs in world affairs. Because zombies used to be human, reanimated, ravenous, flesh-eating corpses could make humans more uncertain about their identity and how it differs from the viably challenged. So the important parts about constructivism: social construction of reality. International relations are social. It's not inevitably one way or the other. It's affected by the way we interact. And identity is really important. Our sense of our own identity and the identity of others in the international system is a contribution that constructivists have made that realists and liberals don't think about. So constructivism says zombies are what humans make of them. And that could mean all varieties of responses. So if confronted with the shock of the undead, constructivists would undoubtedly argue that zombies are what humans make of them. There are a number of possible emergent orders in response to zombies. One possible norm could be the Hobbesian kill or be killed scenario, in which human beings turn on each other as well as the living dead. Some research concludes that the natural response to the rise of the living dead would be sheer panic, leading to genuine anarchy. Most constructivists would instead posit that a pluralistic counter-zombie security community in which governments share sovereignty and resources to combat the undead is a more likely response. Empirical work on how individuals respond to manufactured and natural disasters suggests that this is the more likely outcome. So for example, Rebecca Solnit wrote that in the wake of an earthquake, a bombing, or a major storm, most people are altruistic, urgently engaged in caring for themselves and those around them, strangers and neighbors, as well as friends and loved ones. The image of the selfish, panicky, or regressively savage human being in times of disaster has little truth to it. Anthropological research further suggests that only with extreme resource scarcity will communities of people turn on each other. So this could hold with even greater force if flesh-eating ghouls are the source of the disaster. The existence of zombies might foster some initial ontological insecurity, but over time, the zombie threat itself should create a stronger feeling of collective identity among humans because they have no intrinsic compulsion to consume other people. And this shared sense of identity should, in turn, foster a greater sense of ontological security. For some constructivists, the existential peril posed by zombies could be the shock needed to break down nationalist divides and advance the creation of a world state. However, constructivists are concerned that what we already know about zombies is going to mess this up. So to nudge key actors toward the creation of this kind of pluralistic security community, constructivists would offer two controversial but concrete policy recommendations. The first preemptive move would be to destroy every copy of nearly every zombie film ever made. Intentionally or unintentionally, constructivists argue that the consistency of the zombie narrative socially constructs apocalypse myths. Cultural narratives that suggest panic, disaster, and mayhem can have real-world effects. If everyone expects the rise of the living dead to trigger panic and dystopia, then those misperceptions could very well reify that outcome, self-fulfilling prophecy. The zombie canon stresses the dog-eat-dog or person-eat-person nature of undead apocalypses. Those images could become cemented in both elite and mass public perceptions. At the very least, security institutions should subsidize countervailing narratives about resilience in the face of flesh-eating ghouls. The second policy suggestion would be to socialize zombies into human culture. Zombies aren't social isolates. They seem to prefer to live in groups within built social environments. There are examples in the zombie canon of the living dead learning or adopting human norms of behavior. These examples would be consistent with the socialization efforts advocated by constructivist scholars. If the undead learn to act as if they are human again, then constructivists would posit that they have abandoned their identity as flesh-eating ghouls. At the same time, it could work in the other direction. A thorough constructivist analysis would have to acknowledge a darker possibility. The suggested constructivist policies assume that once zombies walk the earth, humans will be able to socialize them before they proliferate beyond human control. If a critical mass of flesh-eating ghouls were to emerge, however, then constructivists would predict an emergent norm cascade from the proliferation of the living dead. A norm cascade, that's an important term to write down, functions like peer pressure. As people witness others adhering to a particular standard of behavior, they are more likely to conform to that standard of behavior as well. As a larger fraction of individuals are converted to the undead persuasion, the remaining humans would feel significant material and social pressure to conform to zombie practices. Even if humans adopt zombie norms simply to survive, over time these actions will begin to constitute their identity. Norms acquire general acceptance through a combination of greater numbers and the intrinsic attractiveness of the practices themselves. While one could casually dismiss the idea that eating live human flesh would be attractive, other components of the zombie lifestyle might be alluring to many humans. The living dead do not feel the need to bathe, shave, or change their clothes, nor do they judge each other based on appearance. Zombies do not discriminate based on race, color, creed, ethnicity, or sexual orientation. They always hang out in large packs or herds. They are extremely eco-friendly. Zombies walk everywhere, only eat local organic produce. This description accurately captures many of the lifestyle traits of the typical college student, graduate student, or urban hipster, the change agents of many societies. Zombies might have hidden reserves of soft power, leading humans to want to become zombies themselves. If this cultural vanguard were to embrace zombie normcore as a way of life, or even just as a fashion trend, remaining survivors would eventually internalize all zombie norms. These would include guttural moaning, shuffling, and smelling like death warmed over. In the end, both socialized humans and zombies would crave the flesh of unrepentant humans. At this point, the conceptual category of zombies would not be restricted to reanimated corpses. It would be a social construct as well. So constructivism is the kind of first critique of international relations theory. It's not really critical theory. It has emerged into its own mainstream international relations theory. But the security critique, the kind of 1.0 OG security critique, is constructivism. So the Alex Wendt or Ole Waver security K, that was the security K when the security K first came about. We've kind of moved beyond that, usually, into more advanced and more critical theories. But constructivism is the security K. I think that's a good way to think about it. Constructivism is also often discussed in debates in combination with liberal arguments and with neoconservative arguments. So a lot of the arguments we've been having about humanitarian arms control are rooted in constructivism. So the whole idea of the creation of international norms and norm cascades and the spread of international taboos against particular behavior, that's all constructivism. That's all constructivist arguments. And so a lot of people who write about those issues, human rights, international human rights law, that kind of thing, international humanitarian law, they do so from a combination of liberal approaches, but also some insights from constructivism. The whole idea of soft power, Joseph Nye, that came up with that term, he's a liberal, but it's a term that also can be explained and substantiated, perhaps even more eloquently, by constructivists, because they understand that the international system is what we make of it. That's kind of the fundamental thesis of constructivism. The international system, the rules and everything, they aren't established for us. There's no rules of the game beyond what we create in the rules of the game by interacting with others. And a fundamental component of that is our ontological security, meaning the security of our identity, feeling like we know who we are, we know our place in the world. And in a world where everyone knows their place, security is achieved, peace is achieved. But when we don't know our place, or when we have identity problems, when we sort of have an identity crisis as a person or as a country, that leads to instability and to lack of peace. So many arguments in debate, both policy arguments and critique arguments, begin with constructivism or interact with constructivism in some way, and there are many, many cards that you will read in debate that are from constructivists. Constructivists make arguments that tend to play well in debate. They make a lot of arguments about discourse, they make a lot of arguments about the way things are framed or talked about, they make a lot of arguments about perception, and so the reason that they tend to be popular in debate is that they lend themselves to kind of critique style arguments, but they also lend themselves to the kind of arguments that can get around material responses. And so a realist can't answer, that you're materially wrong about this, you're just wrong about this. They can't say, well, but we're perceived as right. Constructivists do. Constructivists take perception very seriously. And so you'll find that in a lot of debates about hegemony and a lot of debates about foreign policy interactions and a lot of debates about security, constructivist themes get in there, even if not explicitly. And understanding what the constructivists are saying and what their insights are can be really powerful in making those arguments better. Roman numeral 6, do domestic politics matter? So all of these international relations theories assume that all of the international system, every country acts the same. Realism says that more explicitly. Some of the others think that there's somewhat of a difference between democracy and authoritarianism. And so Drezner tries to break that down a little bit. So the paradigms discussed have been primarily systemic in their orientation, he says. Their sources of change and explanation come from the international structure as well as interactions among global actors. While elegant, a systemic approach might miss the more fine-grained power struggles that take place within the confines of domestic politics. The structure of domestic institutions, the state of public opinion, or the constellation of interest group pressures can affect a wide array of foreign policy and national security initiatives. At a minimum, domestic pressures can exert powerful constraints on the foreign policy leaders' negotiating tactics and positions when bargaining with other actors. So Drezner proceeds to make a comparison between what would happen in the United States and what would happen in China. And he says that understanding those differences helps us understand how, even though we have these general theories of international behavior, we have to adjust them and adapt them based on the specifics of the context. And some realists would push back against Drezner, but he's just kind of making the argument that this would be realistic. So in the United States, he makes a few observations. He thinks that the executive would initially be in charge of zombie policy. Congress would kind of give the president free rein, but that over time, public opinion would start to push back against some of those zombie policies. He expects an initial rally around the flag effect as a response to a zombie emergency. That's played out before, and support for an initial counter-zombie operations, efforts at home and abroad. But over time, several factors will make policy making more difficult in the anti-zombie context. One is that the families and the zombies themselves, but also their family members, will push back against too much pressure on zombies, and that can alter the preferences of their elected representatives. It can get Congress more involved and get that side involved. So non-governmental organizations, like we talked about before, will start being involved. They'll start pushing back against some of the counter-zombie operations. But at the same time, corporations, especially defense contractors, will be pushing for even more money to be spent in countering the zombie threat. So while the idea, he says, of a singular cohesive zombie industrial complex stretches credulity, some corporations in the security sector would undoubtedly be intrigued by the military applications of zombies. And so domestic political pressures could sabotage multilateral efforts to stop ghouls because the powerful lobbying interests will get involved and will shape American policy. In China, it would play out much differently. So in China, initially, the CCP and the authoritarian government would be able to effectively mobilize a counter-zombie response with very little public pressure. They don't face any democratic elections. Their major concern is just the public going along with them. They don't care about public preferences. And so they make leadership a lot different than leadership in a democratic country. Drezner says leaders of such countries have a much smaller fraction of supporters to please than leaders facing democratic electorates. It becomes possible with such a small selectorate for China's leaders to keep their political supporters happy through the transfer of private goods rather than investments in much more expensive public goods. At the same time, the hierarchical political system in China also incentivizes regional leaders to provide overly rosy data to their superiors in Beijing as a pathway to promotion. So that problem that the liberals were running into before about how some countries aren't going to report the right data, they're not going to be doing following the global plan for confronting the zombie threat, China might experience some of that. But over time, the Chinese domestic pressures might cause them to pull back on their anti-zombie campaign because of public pressure or because of incompetent execution of the plan. So if the undead problem persisted, the Chinese response would likely become less effective. China's central leadership would experience the problem of relying on local proxies to implement orders. Such officials might be overly optimistic in their feedback. This would cause the top Chinese leadership to overestimate the effectiveness of its initial response. China's regime would also have a greater incentive to allocate more of its counter-zombie response to excludable private goods rather than non-excludable public goods. That means protecting the rich people, not protecting the normal people. This would potentially take the form of exclusive areas where they protect a certain part of the country but not others. These efforts would preserve key political supporters, but the expense of measures to protect the rest of China China's population. And so what Drezner concludes is that at the beginning stages, both countries would kind of have similar responses. There'd be slight differences, but the president would basically do whatever he wants in America, CCP would do whatever they want in China. But over time, their preferences would diverge, and that is going to create a problem with international cooperation. So over time, both countries will be unable to maintain that initial momentum that they had developed trying to stop the zombies, and it'll actually, because of domestic political pressures, differences in domestic political pressures in the United States versus China and other non-democracies, it makes the cooperation harder over the long term. That's the observation. What's the debate relevant of this? Sweeping claims about IR theory that are not contextualized to the specific context tend not to be very persuasive. There certainly are hardliners who think that just some theory of realism explains everything, some theory of liberalism explains everything, some theory of constructivism explains everything, less so that last one. Some neoconservatives certainly think their thing explains everything. But contextualization and finding IR scholarship about specific countries tends to be significantly more valuable. And a lot of times, issues with domestic constraints throw a monkey wrench into sweeping explanation or totalizing explanations of IR behavior. All right, last Roman numeral, conclusions. Drezner's fundamental conclusion is that there is a lot more agreement than you would think. IR theory offers some interesting and various predictions and recommendations about how governments, international institutions, domestic interests, bureaucracies, and individuals respond to the transnational threat posed by the living dead. A quick review reveals some interesting continuities across the different theoretical paradigms. Most of these approaches would predict that the living dead would have an unequal effect on different national governments. Powerful states would be more likely to withstand an army of flesh-eating ghouls. Weaker and developing countries would be more vulnerable to a zombie infestation. Complete eradication of the zombie menace would be extremely unlikely. The plague of the undead would join the roster of threats that disproportionately affect the poorest and weakest countries. But he thinks that there are a variety of possible outcomes, and it might not be as bad as we think, and that each theory kind of has something interesting to say about the solution. So traditional zombie narratives in film and fiction are quick to get to the apocalypse. Most theoretical approaches suggest there will be a vigorous policy response. Realism posits an eventual live and let live arrangement between the undead and everyone else. Liberals predict an imperfect but useful counter-zombie regime. Neoconservatives believe that an aggressive and thorough military deployment would keep the undead menace at bay. Some constructivists would predict a robust, pluralistic security community dedicated to preventing new zombie outbreaks and socializing existing zombies into human society. Organizations might err in their initial response, but they could also adapt and overcome. Individuals would be hardwired toward an aggressive policy response against the living dead. These kinds of predictions suggest that maybe, just maybe, the zombie canon's dominant narrative of human extinction is overstated. It's still going to be disastrous, it's still going to be bad, but each theory has some way of approaching this problem and maybe contributing to a solution. He concludes that one of his conclusions is that all of the theories are not so good when we move away from the state. And he uses zombies on purpose because that's the kind of transnational threat that we're now facing. So all of these kind of hard-coded, older, classical theories of international relations, they're not as powerful as they used to be. He says unless these theories can adapt to the plethora of asymmetric threats to the human race, they will be hard-pressed to offer cogent policy responses to the living dead. And he connects that to other issues like natural disasters, diseases, terrorism, and the things like that. So his final conclusion is, how do we decide which theory is best? And he says we don't have to. So how can we assess the explanatory potential of each paradigm's predictions? Is only one of them true? Some of them, all of them. In the social sciences, the best way to adjudicate among different theories is to devise empirical tests that buttress or falsify the different approaches. For the zombie question at hand, that is neither desirable nor plausible, clearly. The IR scholar must concede that analytical rigor alone is an insufficient basis for political judgment on how to respond to the living dead. A paradigmatic approach to explaining political outcomes provides some useful analytical tools, but the toolkit remains incomplete. Even IR theorists themselves are aware of this fact. Perhaps individual realists would treat zombies as different from humans. Perhaps advocates of legislative constraints would allow that an attack from the living dead might overwhelm Congress's ability to respond. It's possible that when confronted with a concrete policy problem like flesh-eating ghouls, specific microtheories, contingent hypotheses that apply to a very narrow set of circumstances might be more useful than the grand paradigms. Having the judgment to know which models apply in world politics and when is more art than science. IR theory clearly retains some practical utility. Perhaps, however, the ability of these theories to explain current global threats and challenges is more circumscribed than IR theorists proclaim in their scholarship. Informed by these paradigms, the interested and intelligent students of world politics should use their own brains to cogitate on this question before the zombies decide to use them instead. So what does that mean for debate? Winning a theory doesn't win an argument. Winning a theory doesn't win the debate, and it's not even clear what winning a theory means. How can you prove that realism is correct? You can't prove that. It's not like a certain set of facts would prove that theory. It does make sense, however, to make consistent arguments and to make sure that your arguments all can agree at a conceptual level. But because it is all impossible to prove, what you need to do is you need to take the insights of each IR theory, take the insights of scholars who are working in each of these scholarly traditions, and then craft the very best arguments you can that are contextualized to whatever the issue is that you're debating about. That said, learning about IR theory, I think, is very powerful and can help you make better arguments because it allows you to work through the assumptions that authors make, and it allows you to work through where they came up with the ideas that they're coming up with. And you can use, your understanding of those theories to kind of test your argument, test your opponent's arguments. Is it consistent? Does it all come from the same place? Does it support the same conclusion? What are the assumptions that it's making? And then if you can figure out what those assumptions are, you can attack it at the level not just of the conclusion, but also at the level of the underlying logic, the underlying grounding and warrants that the IR theory presents. So zombies are obviously not something you're ever going to debate in a debate, but you are going to debate a bunch of things, especially on this topic, humanitarian arms control related issues, that zombies are a perfect stand-in for. And so if you think about learning IR theory in the context of zombies, I think it'll help you learn IR theory in all contexts. So that's the end of this one. Tomorrow we will do critical IR theory for some of you, and that is it.